Okay, so we are continuing with our weekly series of shirim on the Mitteler Rebbe Shaar HaYichud, and last week we only learned through the first half of Parak Yud Gimel, which is the parak discussing the Reshimu of the Or Ein Sof, the irreducible trace of infinitude that remains within the Chalal HaPanui, which begins to be the expression of the infinite to us after the Tzimtzum itself. So because of the potency of the metaphors, we paused in half of the parak, and we're going to go right there now to go through the entire parak to better understand the nature of the Reshimu be'ezras Hashem. Zak the Heilige Mitteler Rebbe. Hine be'emes, after all is said and done in terms of describing the Reshimu through the metaphor of a mashpia who wants to give over wisdom to a student, and even though the student is not receiving the essence of the wisdom, because the essence of the wisdom would be too overwhelming and all inundating, and therefore the mashpia has to be mitzam same themselves. But it's not that the tzimtzum has removed all of the other information that the mashpia knows, but rather it's all encasing the information being conveyed, meaning to say that the tzimtzum is a hisrachavus, a hisrazkus of the information. It's the condensing of all information to create an external perimeter and limit where all of those thoughts are still there, but they're there by being actively held back so as to allow for a kernel of information to descend down. So that kernel of information is the nature of the Reshimu, the irreducible trace of the infinite, that even though it's no longer expressing itself as infinite, it's still, if you dig down deep into it, you're going to come to find the infinite itself. But, says the Mitteler Rebbe, there's even better ways for us to really understand this complicated relationship between the infinite light as it was in its essence prior to the Tzimtzum and the Roshim of the infinite light, the irreducible trace of the infinite light that remains after the Tzimtzum. Zok the Heilige Mitteler Rebbe. Everything we just described about the nature of thinking and the tzimtzum of the machshava and the wisdom of the mashpia in the moment of hashpa'a itself as the model or the metaphor for understanding the tzimtzum and the reishem, the Mitteler Rebbe says that's not really the mashal or the metaphor that we need to be using. Why? Ki hu mora shenistalik misham hakol velo shenishar eze or rak shehu bekitzer v'gvul. Aval ella rak bechinas reshimu be'alma. The issue with this metaphor of the Reshimu as being the remainder of the information that is being conveyed, while all of the other information, which is akin to the infinite light of the mashpia, is being removed. In that metaphor, the imagined perspective is that there's only a trace that remains in the vacant and emptied space, which implies that there was an actual removal of all of the infinite light, and all that remained was a kitzer or a limit that contains all things. And so that metaphor conveys a certain separation or a fundamental separation between the essence and the roshim of the essence itself, which is not the proper way of conveying the metaphor itself. In came hadimyon ha'amiti hu meroishem v'tzion kav katzer sha'osin ha'umdim sha'koilel kol ha'arichus ma'iseh ha'binyan. A better metaphor would be like the blueprints that the architect describes and draws down. And in those slight lines and measurements, it reflects the exact dimensionality on a smaller scale as the measurements of the home itself, meaning to say that the Roshim is not just a remainder of the infinite light that has departed, now that there's infinite light up there and there's the departed, depleted element of infinitude down here, but rather the presence of the infinite light down here in the aspect of the Roshim is like a miniature that contains the maximum. It's like a blueprint that has the exact dimensionality of the thing that it actually represents. It's just on a minimized level. And that's what the koyach of the Roshim is. It's not that there is now a deep separation between the infinite light and the trace of the infinite light, but rather the trace of the infinite light is actually an imprint and a sign or a tzion or an engraving that contains the totality of what the infinite light is coming to reveal. And even more intense than that metaphor, then the blueprint is going to be the sign that a person creates for themselves for memory, to the degree that that demonic device, that Dailacha Kima Biramiza, that the remez itself is enough to reveal all that the remez comes to represent. Remez stands for Re'eh Ma'zeh. It's just a hint, it's just a sign, but nevertheless, the sign is reflective of the entirety, so that the Roshem Hadavar, in fact, is expressive of the essence of the thing. It's just being revealed by way of a sign. Keniz Gala'el. V'kach lemala ksiv zecher rav tuvcha ha'atzmi. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu also creates, so to speak, these mnemonic devices. Zecher Rav Tuvcha Ha'atzmi. The zikaron of your Rav Toiv is a reflection of the Rav Toiv Ha'atzmi, meaning the essential quality of goodness from within HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That gets concealed, but ultimately the point at which it gets revealed is in a Zecher Rav Tuvcha, in a mnemonic device that holds the place for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's unbridled goodness, and even though it's a more minimized spot, nevertheless, it still reflects and is embellic of the essential goodness. V'chi hagavna. V'yoter behe'elem ubehistalkus hu kimashal hazoyrek even v'chulei kenizka le'el. And there is another way of looking at the metaphor of the Reshimu, which does imply a little bit more of a separation, right? We're just correcting the notion of getting to look at the Reshimu as being fundamentally separate from the infinite light. So the Mitteler Rebbe is correcting that with two metaphors of either the blueprint or the sign that stands in the place of the thing itself. But there's also more difficult ways of looking at the metaphor of the Roshem, which would create more of a separation. V'yoter behe'elem u'behistalkus. If a person wants to look in a more concealed way or with a sense of more separation, who kamashal hazoyrek even. It's the mashal of somebody who throws a stone, v'chule, where the stone is no longer in the hands of the thrower, and therefore there's an actual separation between the source and the emergent of that power. But nevertheless, that rock that's being thrown continues to move along with the reducible trace of the energy that was present at the original moment of throwing. The Chach Amar b'Sefer HaBahir. This is what the Sefer HaBahir implies, kemo zarka, that the Metzias, the Roshim, is like a zarka. It's like HaKadosh Baruch Hu threw something, and the thing that's thrown still contains a trace of that koach of the thrower, even though it's separate from the thrower. Shahare bechinas hareshimu nishar nivdal berichuk makom me'atzmas ha'or. In this metaphor of throwing the stone, the reshimu, the irreducible trace of infinitude, now is shown to be something that's fundamentally separate by way of spatial separation from the essential light. V'chulei v'nikra koach ha'ne'elam bereshimu zu bechinas ha'elem or nivdal me'ha'elem atzmas or the ein sof. When we're dealing with this metaphor of real separation between the Roishem and the essence, which is like the essence is the person who's the thrower, and the Roishem is the strength that remains propelling the rock forward even after it's left the hand. That's one way of looking at the Reshimu as something that is almost completely and separate and apart from the Atzmas of the Or Ein Sof. And this is referred to as the He'elem or Nivdal me'ha'elem atzmas ha'or. This concealment of the light in the way that we see the Roshem as something that's, God forbid, separate, is very different than the essential concealment of the infinite light itself. There, the concealment is the revelation of that which cannot be revealed. It's revealed by the fact that it can't be revealed. Here, the Ha'elem is more of a nituk, it's more of a separation where the Roshem no longer seems to be fundamentally caught up and connected to the source of the throwing. Kamo koach nivdal ha'ne'elam bezrikas ha'even shaba mikoach hayad shekvar ne'elam ba'atzmo. In this situation, what we're talking about is a Ha'elem simply because there is now a separation between the source of the energy and the extension of the energy itself. And the Mitteler Rebbe gives an example of this type of orientation of thinking about the Reshimu, the irreducible trace of infinite light, as being reflective of a koach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's infinitude that is no longer active and no longer present, but rather it's simply propelling the present moment. This is kind of the lowest metaphor of looking at the Reshimu, where it begins to look as something that's separate. And the Mitteler Rebbe associates this with the Galgalim, with the planetary movements and the constellations and the Koich Ve'lechet and all of this intermediary space wherein the celestial shapes of the Yud Beis quadrants of the Mazalim kind of serve as an interface or an in-between wherein Shamayim descends down to the Aretz, where it seems that they're a Roshim of the infinite light. They are set in motion by God, but it seems to no longer be fundamentally connected to the infinite light of God. That's the lowest expression of the Roshim. Ukadimion kol hagalgalim v'kol chavelechet shetzovim mikoyach tnua eloki hane'elem sheba, that the planets and the movement of the stars and the celestial bodies all move by way of the tnuah, the movement that is set within them by way of the concealed power of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it's in the aspect of being thrown to the degree that all that is expressive there is only the tes kelim hachitzonim de malchus ta'asiyah, which is the lowest place prior to our world itself, where it no longer it seems fundamentally connected to the infinite light. It now seems separate. This is the point at the point of reality of our world, of physiological reality and physical reality, it seems that the Reshimu is no longer fundamentally attached to the source of the infinite light that it's coming to reflect, and that's the Malchus of Malchus Haba be'erech richuk nivdal velo kemo haksiva be'etzva. This nature of the Reshimu, of the throw, where the energy of my throw continues to propel the rock even after my arm is no longer expressing the energy, that's a lower way of looking at the Reshimu because there's a real separation, at least according to that metaphor. It's very different than the engraving of a sign or writing a line on a blueprint where the energy of the writing is inherent within the act of writing itself. Here, in the level of the throw, it seems that there's an actual separation to the degree that we're talking about kocho and koach kocho. And the Mitteler Rebbe makes this distinction. He says this way of thinking about the zrika, which is where I take my energy and I throw something away so that the thing is no longer fundamentally connected to the point of the emergence of the energy. So it's different than writing, because in the act of writing with a hand or writing with a person's hand or finger or doing something active, the active participation of the strength of the hand is present within the expression itself. When the hand is actively engaged in avoda, the koyach is embedded within the Reshimu and it's not separate. That's the element of malchus. Mishalim hayoter kroivim lazeh hu kamo haremez שהשכל בהיעלם בתנועה הגשמית, שזהו נקרא בחינת הלבשה ותפיסה בדבר נבדל וכולי. And a great way of understanding this is utilizing the knowledge of a remez, a hint in the mind that creates an awakening within the body to impart the wisdom that the mind is trying to convey. So it's like conveying something with one's hands, where the movement of the hand is ultimately reflective of the processes of the mind, and they're not separate and they're not disconnected like the stone that's disconnected from the thrower. Over here, there's an actual halbasha, there's an engulfment of the energy of the mind within the body itself. V'tfisa b'davar nivdal. And so too, when a person is writing out words of wisdom with their fingers, ultimately what we're coming to understand is that there's ways of looking at the Reshimu as a separate power that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has expressed in the world that continues to draw its vitality from the source of all that which is essential with regards to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's revelation. Amnan, all of these metaphors, the writing and the blueprint and the hinting and the throwing, all of these different metaphors and the conveying, these all come to describe the nature of the Reshimu. But nevertheless, from within all of these metaphors, and each metaphor provides a particular angle and a point of understanding the relationship between the infinite source of all things and the irreducible trace of that infinitude that remains within the vacancy of that infinite light itself. They all come to describe to us the nature of the Reshimu. The Gam Shuhu Ba B'Bechinas Istalkus Hakol V'Loi Nishar Barak Behelem Godel B'Bechinas Tachlis Hakitzer V'Haremez. That even though all that remains is a tiny irreducible trace and a mark or the smallest amount, and all the essential part of it has left already, nevertheless, we find ourselves living with the kitzer or the quintessential drop. O b'koach nivdal, either way, metaphor. Aval mikol makom mizeh atzmo ba v'nimshach kol pratei ha'eshtalshlus dekav shenimshach merishimu zu. Nevertheless, even though we're talking about the Reshimu, as if it's just this irreducible trace that remains after the Tzimtzum, and that it's just a quintessential drop, and it's just the Tam Sitza and Yanim, and it's the Derech HaKitzer, and it's an imprint and an impression and a sign of that which it comes to reflect, which implies a deep division between the sign and the signified. Nevertheless, this sign, this Reshimu, is in and of itself the beginning of the entirety of the Seder Shtalshalus, because the Kav or Ein Sof Kav Yachol is going to be mamshech itself from within this Reshimu, because this is what we're dealing with. The Reshimu is still this potency of the infinite revealing itself. It's just revealing itself by way of minimization and concealment so that it can begin to take shape within the Seder of Hishtalshalus. The Kav is nimshach from the Reshimu, because it's within this Reshimu, it's within this irreducible trace of the infinite light that remains, remains, lahayoso koleles hakol behe'elem al kol panim, that in spite of the fact that it appears to be a diminution away from the infinite light, nevertheless, it's a diminution that contains the entirety of the infinite light within itself. Hu hanaisenes sheyachol lavo hakol behisgalus al yedei b'chinas kav ad soifa asiya. It makes sense now that once we're dealing with the Reshimu, that even though it's a minimization, we're still speaking of minimization of the infinite, which still retains the elements of the infinite. So it makes sense how we could speak of the Kav, the infinite ray of light that re-enters into the Chalal Panui, that extends itself through the worlds of Adam Kadmon, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzira, and Asiya, down to the bottom of Asiya, the Asiya, which is where we find ourselves. Kema Amar Kol Hayatzur, V'loy Nechad Mimcha, Mimcha Dafka, meaning to say that in the end of the day, all of creation, even that which exists in the lowest realms, is all directly from the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that is expressed within the Reshimu itself. And even though the Reshimu is embellic of the infinite light, nevertheless, it's a step lower than the infinite light, even though it's not different than the infinite light. And ultimately, it's that radical secret of the Roshem that it's not the infinite light, but it enables the drip drop of the infinite light to come back down into the Seder of Hishtalshalos. We see that everything is ultimately emerging from Mimcha Dafka, meaning to say that even though there's the Tzimtzum that reveals the beginning of the Reshimu, and the Reshimu is no longer the light before the Tzimtzum, nevertheless, the Reshimu contains the potency of the light before the Tzimtzum because it still ultimately contains light before the Tzimtzum. And as such, it has the properties of the light before the Tzimtzum, and it has the ability to be the source of all things within the Seder of Hishtalshalos. Shezehu hakol naaseh v'nimshach begilui k'mo she'ala b'ritzono hapashut ba'atzmus ha'or shelifnei hatzimtzum k'mo she'shir ba'atzmo v'chulei. Meaning to say that everything that is revealed in the Reshimu and afterwards is exactly like the simplicity of the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to reveal himself as it was determined before the Tzimtzum, meaning that the Reshimu is the process in which the estimation, so to say, of the space of being and the potential of being is ultimately going to emerge. Shaharei b'machshava keduma zu, shashir ba'atzmo, husayfe umabit hakol beskira achas. Because when it comes to this original thought for creation, so to say, the thought of shir ba'atzmo b'koach, prior to the tzimtzum, which begins to be the engine that drives the entirety of the tzimtzum, which reveals the next shlav of the Reshimu, which has the quintessential essence of the Atzmas or Ein Sof, even though there's been a Tzimtzum, it contains everything within itself, all possibility, all possibilities of possibilities. It's all contained within the one fell swoop of the Shir Atzma B'Koyach, of that Machshava Keduma, of that Malchus de Ein Sof, of Kodem HaTzimtzum. Dahainu Masha Niskar Behe'elem U'Bekitzer V'Remez B'Reshimu Zu, meaning to say that this Reishem and everything that is going to emerge from it and everything that is contained within it by way of potential, standing at the ready to be revealed in actuality as it descends down the number line of the Seder Hishtalshalos, all of it is exactly the same as the Shir Atzmai B'Koyach, that original desire that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for Metzias. The Hareza Kemashal Reishem Ha'uman Shemimenu Dafka Yedela Asos Kol Ha'arichos Maisa Habinyan Beprate Pratusav Meroisha L'Soifoi Rak Kedei Shelo Yit'alei Mimenu Taimo V'Nimuko Ba'atzmus La'arichos Ha'inyan Hu Oiseloi Reishem L'Zikaron Shleyanata Mizeh V'Lo Yitztarech La'ayin Ba'atzmo Mechadash U'Kmo Ken. So what the Reishem is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kavyachol is like the boina of a building who knows exactly what he wants to do. He wants to build a building, and the building has all of its particularized dimensions. And in order to make sure that he doesn't have to go back to the original thought of the building each and every time, what the builder does is he engraves a katnus, a remez, that contains the blueprint of the entire building. So instead of having to go back to that original thought, there can be a remez that contains a reminder of all that stands at the ready to be revealed. That's the secret of this Reishem. It's the quintessential hint of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light that remains. Another mashal for it, of the Reishem, which is this quintessential remainder that contains the blueprint of the entirety folded into itself by way of the kitzer, so that it's a kitzer that contains the arichos within it. It's also like the tziyunim, where a person engraves a certain sign for themselves, a certain reminder, l'limud amok sheba'atzmo, meaning a deep wisdom that a person knows the depth of the sugya and can descend down into the yam of that sugya, but in order to remind themselves of the depth, they create a tzion for themselves. They mark, they underline, they highlight, they fold a page to remember that there's an amkus here. Does the fold of the page represent the amkus? No, but what the mind knows about the amkus is contained within the underlining or the tzion that they've done for themselves. Says Zehu toeles leida mehem kol oirech iun oimek atzmuso shieshlo pen yinata mimenu. And this reminder, this folded page reminds the reader, the thinker, that there's a profound depth here. It's there in order to ensure the memory of the depth, and it represents the depth. V'kach bechinas hareshimu hazois hakoileles beremez ubekitzur meikol or ha'atzmus hane'elemba. And so too the roshim of the or in soif kavyachol, which is like a kitzer, which is like a quintessential offering of all that is contained, all of the essence that's contained within it by way of hiddenness. It's all there. Hu atzmo hamakor lechol hahamshachos tekav v'chut b'bechinas makif upnimi meirosh l'soifai. This Reshimu, it's not separate of the infinite light. It's a remainder of the infinite light. It holds all of the potency that the infinite light can convey, all of the infinite light that descends down into the process of creation itself, the part that doesn't remain surrounding existence by way of the concealment of the essence, but rather all that is set to be expressed within the Seder Ashtalshalis is contained within this Reshimu. The Reshimu is the remainder that remains after the infinite light has departed, and it's a remainder that reflects the depth of infinitude, and it's the beginning of the Seder Ashtalshalis, and everything, the Kav and the Chut, and all of the Ilamos, and Ak and Abiyah, and the Makif and the Panimim, and the head to the bottom, all of it is contained within that original Ratzon, and the Chachma Hapshuta Sheba Atzmas Orin Seif Mamish. It's all reflective of that which remains before the tzimtzum. V'zeu ma shekasu b'makom acher. Shahanekuda yesh boy he'elem v'hiskalus. The nekuda is a reshimu. The nekuda reshimu is a tiny dot, a quintessential dot, an infinitesimal point that reflects the infinitude that is bound up within it. So on the one hand, the tzimtzum is magala, this nekuda, which is mastir, all of the light of it, and therefore it's only a nekuda, which means it's a tzimtzum. But at the same point, it's also a giloy, because this is going to be the very beginning point at which all emergence eventually emerges from. So any revelation, the yud is always a tzimtzum and a giloy. It's a condensing of everything down to a bite-sized, manageable point, and then that point extends itself and expresses itself further and further and further. It has two elements. It has a he'elim and a hiskalus at the same time. Beis hafachim. There's two oppositional expressions within this pointed expression of the roshim. He'elim mikol masha elyon himenu be'erech v'giloi l'chol hakol makablim, meaning it's a concealment of everything that precedes it, and it's a revelation to everything that follows it. It's the point that rests in the very middle. It's the point of the os beis. Everything is going to come from it dafka. And this is the secret of the vav, which extends itself out of the yud of the Reshimu, the kav orin sof, and the beginningness of all existence that is going to emerge out of this Reshimu. Shu ketzuras vav, sharosho yud. It's like the tzura of a vav whose head is a yud. It emerges. It's the secret of the emergence from within the Reshimu itself. And it descends downwards, downwards, downwards. As is explained elsewhere at length. Now we have a basic understanding, says the Mitteler Rebbe, of the tzimtzum, the empty space, the retaining of that irreducible point of the infinite light that represents a quick way of conveying the elongation and the depth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's infinitude, never separate from the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but also not identifiable with the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a shlav nosefet that allows for our perspective, mitzidenu, from our perspective of post the tzimtzum, to understand the source of all emergence, which is going to be the secret of the Reshimu of the infinite light and the kav or in sof that comes out of it, which is then going to become the source of Adam Kadmon, and then we're going to have Atzilus, Bri Yitzir, and Asiya down to Asiya Shaba Asiya. Shirak Bechinas Hagvala Ba'atzmuso Kadesh Yumshach HaKol Begiloi. All of this containment, all of this concealing, all of this preparation and the condensing into the particular pointed nature of the revelation, it's all for the preparatory act of revelation afterwards. And this is the secret of Ki Imka Mechor Chayim, Be'orcha Ha'atzmo Nira Or, meaning it is with you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the source of life is with, that it's within your essential light that we're going to come to find a light, which is the Reshimu, which is reflective of your essential light, in spite of the fact that it's not identifiable with your essential light, even though it's a tolda it comes from it, nevertheless, it's a bechina of the kav, kamoshe yisbar be'ezras Hashem. So, be'orcha nira or, there's a light that emerges from within your essential light, which is the light of the Reshimu, which becomes the source of the Seder Shtalshalis. V'zeh kol ha'adam, and this is the entire tachlis of the human being, laha'amik dasa b'kol, to deepen our understanding of this, how everything that is revealed to us is ultimately just a revelation of that which is beyond revelation. And that which is beyond revelation and not something that can be revealed is perpetually being revealed in revelation itself by way of concealment. We have to contemplate this. We have to deepen our understanding of this. And to understand the sugyos of tzimtzum, dafka yavo haklal HaYichud ha'amiti behiskashrus nafsho b'chaye kol ha'chayim. It's only when we become aware of the fact that all of the infinitesimal expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light after the tzimtzum is ultimately just a revelation of the infinite light from before the tzimtzum, then we come to understand how it's specifically by way of creation itself and by way of the gradational levels themselves that seem to be so far apart from the infinite light of simplicity and unity that we're going to be able to access the Chaye HaChayim. It's the or from within the or that enables us to return back to the or. That it's the Chayim that enables us to return back to the Chaye HaChayim. Ha'elyonim shu atzmas or in soif mamish mitam haniskal el v'day lamevin. Ultimately, what the Reshimu is teaching us is the secret of all secrets, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mitzamsim himself, but the tzimtzum is not mastir on the infinitude of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light. It's still going to be a quintessential expression of the essence. And ha'toifes chelik min ha'essence toifes etzem kulo. Someone who grasps one part of the essence grasps the entirety of the klal. And this is the pathway to finding within the irreducible trace of the remainder of infinitude an access point back to an infinitude that is quite literally not available to us because it breaks the system, but nevertheless we live with an awareness of that infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that does break the system. It remains present within the system itself, Be'ezras Hashem.